I've been covering business stories for 15 years, but nothing prepared me for the phone call I received last Tuesday from my editor at Entrepreneurship Today. Mike, I need you to get on a plane to Miami. There's a woman there who built a regional airline from scratch after her husband abandoned her at an airport. It's exactly the kind of midlife transformation story our readers love. The woman's name was Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, and her story began 3 years ago in one of the most humiliating ways imaginable, standing alone at Miami International Airport, 8 weeks pregnant, watching her husband's first-class flight to New York disappear into the clouds without her. When I first met Sarah at her airline's headquarters in Coral Gables, I was struck by her presence. At 54, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought hard-won battles and emerged victorious. Her corner office overlooked the maintenance hangar, where 3 aircraft bore the distinctive teal and gold livery of Atlantic Breeze Airlines, the company she had built from nothing but determination and a business degree that had been gathering dust for 2 decades. "You want to know about the day my life changed?" Sarah asked, settling into her chair with the measured grace of a woman who had learned to command rooms full of skeptical investors. "It started with what I thought was a romantic getaway to Miami and ended with me discovering who I really was when I stopped being who everyone else needed me to be." Sarah had been married to Robert Montgomery for 24 years. At 58, Robert was everything that looked good on paper: a successful investment banker, member of 3 country clubs, owner of a sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. He was the kind of man who wore his success like an expensive suit, never letting anyone forget that he had earned his place at the top of the financial world through sheer brilliance and determination. Rob was charismatic, Sarah told me, her fingers absently turning the simple gold band she still wore, not her wedding ring, but a new piece she had bought herself to mark her airline's first profitable quarter. When we met at Columbia Business School in the early 2000s, he was the guy everyone gravitated toward: smart, ambitious, funny when he wanted to be. I was this small-town girl from Ohio who couldn't believe someone like him was interested in me. The early years of their marriage had been a whirlwind of social climbing and career building, at least for Robert. Sarah had graduated summa cum laude with concentrations in international business and operations management. But somehow her dreams had gotten lost in the shuffle of supporting Robert's increasingly demanding career. "I had plans," Sarah said, pulling out a worn folder from her desk drawer. Inside were printouts of her graduate thesis on airline deregulation and emerging market opportunities. The pages yellowed with age, but the analysis still sharp and prescient. "I wanted to work in aviation management. I was fascinated by the complexity of moving people around the world, the logistics of it all, the way a single decision could ripple through an entire network." Instead, Sarah had become the perfect corporate wife. She organized dinner parties for Robert's clients, served on the boards of appropriate charities, maintained their social calendar, and gradually watched her own ambitions fade into the background of their shared life. It was a slow erosion, the kind that happens one small compromise at a time until you wake up one day and realize you've disappeared entirely. "The thing about emotional abuse," Sarah explained, "is that it's often so subtle you don't recognize it as abuse. Robert never hit me, never screamed at me. He just had this way of making me feel like my ideas were cute but impractical, like I was playing at being a businesswoman while he handled the real work." The Miami trip had been Robert's idea, ostensibly to celebrate their recent decision to start a family. At 51, Sarah had been ambivalent about pregnancy, worried about the risks and challenges of having a child so late in life. But Robert had been surprisingly enthusiastic, and she had convinced herself that a baby would bring them closer together. They had been at the airport, preparing to board their flight back to New York, when Robert's phone rang. The call was supposedly from a client in Singapore, a deal worth hundreds of millions that required his immediate attention. Sarah watched her husband's face transform as he spoke, saw the familiar signs of his complete absorption in work to the exclusion of everything else. "Sarah, I need to stay in Miami for a few more days," Robert had announced after hanging up. "The Singapore situation is more complicated than we thought. You should go back to New York without me." Sarah had protested, reminding him that she was in her first trimester, that the doctor had advised against traveling alone, that this was supposed to be their celebration trip. But Robert's mind was already elsewhere, calculating profit margins and risk assessments with the single-minded focus that had made him successful and had slowly poisoned their marriage. "You'll be fine," he had said, the dismissive tone she knew so well. "You always are. Besides, you can use the time to start planning the nursery or whatever it is pregnant women do." The casual cruelty of the comment had taken Sarah's breath away. 24 years of marriage, and her husband genuinely believed that her primary concern about pregnancy should be interior decorating. Not her fears about their relationship, not her excitement about becoming a mother for the first time, not her need for emotional support during a vulnerable time, just nursery planning. Standing at gate B-17 at Miami International Airport, watching Robert stride toward the business class line without looking back, Sarah had felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The hurt was there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something else entirely: relief. "I should have been devastated," Sarah told me, her voice steady with the clarity that comes from hard-won self-knowledge. "I should have been crying, begging him not to leave me alone and pregnant in a strange city. Instead, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years." The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "Final boarding call for Flight 892 to New York LaGuardia." Sarah watched her husband disappear down the jet bridge without a backward glance and realized she didn't want to follow him. For the first time in decades, she wanted to make a decision based on what she needed rather than what someone else expected from her. She called her younger sister Jennifer, who lived in Miami Beach with her husband David, a marine biologist at the University of Miami. Jennifer had been trying to convince Sarah to visit for years, but there had always been some obligation in Robert's schedule that took priority. "Jen, it's me. Robert left. He actually got on the plane without me." "What do you mean he left you? Where are you?" "Gate B-17 at Miami International. He had some business crisis and told me to go back to New York alone." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Jen, I'm pregnant." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. "I'm coming to get you right now. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Just wait for me." As Sarah waited in the departing passengers area, she watched other couples saying goodbye. Tender kisses, promises to call, genuine emotion passing between people who would miss each other. When had she and Robert stopped looking at each other that way? When had their marriage become a business arrangement where she was just another asset to be managed? Jennifer found her sister sitting alone near the windows, overlooking the tarmac, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like armor. At 46, Jennifer looked younger than Sarah despite being 8 years her junior. Marriage to Robert had aged Sarah in ways she was only beginning to recognize: the constant vigilance of trying to anticipate his needs, the exhaustion of never being quite good enough, the slow erosion of confidence that comes from having your judgment questioned at every turn. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry," Jennifer said, wrapping her arms around her sister. "Are you okay?" Sarah stood up slowly, one hand instinctively moving to her still flat belly. "Jen, I think I'm about to find out who I really am when I don't have to be Robert's wife anymore." As they walked through the airport toward the parking garage, Sarah caught her reflection in the terminal windows. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, well-dressed, well-groomed, but hollow somehow, as if all the important parts of her had been slowly erased over the years. "Jen," she said as they reached her sister's car, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. When you look at me, do you see someone who could survive on her own? Do you see someone strong enough to start over?" Jennifer stopped walking and turned to face her sister directly. "Sarah, you're one of the strongest people I know. You just forgot it somewhere along the way. I'm 51 years old, pregnant for the first time, and I just got abandoned in Florida by my husband. I don't feel very strong right now. Then let me remind you who you were before Robert convinced you to disappear." Jennifer unlocked her car and helped Sarah into the passenger seat. "You were brilliant in business school. You graduated at the top of your class. You wrote a thesis on airline deregulation that your professor said was PhD-level work. You had dreams, Sarah, big dreams." As they drove through the streets of Miami, past the Art Deco buildings of South Beach and the gleaming towers of downtown, Sarah stared out at a city that seemed to pulse with energy and possibility. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of people who had taken risks, who had built something from nothing, who had refused to accept limitations. What happened to those dreams? Jen. You married a man who was threatened by them. But Sarah, just because you put your dreams on hold doesn't mean they died. Maybe this is your chance to wake them up. Jennifer's house in Coral Gables was everything Sarah's Greenwich mansion wasn't: warm, lived in, filled with the kind of personal touches that made a space feel like home rather than a showcase. The walls were covered with photographs from Jennifer and David's travels, marine biology research, and family gatherings that Sarah had missed due to Robert's scheduling conflicts. "I can't believe I've never visited you here," Sarah said, accepting a cup of chamomile tea from her sister. "You were always too busy supporting Robert's career to travel anywhere that wasn't business-related," Jennifer replied gently. "When was the last time you took a vacation that was just for you?" Sarah thought hard, scanning back through years of memories. Every trip they had taken had been to places that served Robert's professional networking goals: the Hamptons for client dinners, Aspen for banking conferences, European cities where Robert had business meetings. She couldn't remember the last time she had been somewhere, simply because she wanted to experience it. "I honestly can't remember. Every vacation was really a work trip in disguise." Jennifer settled onto the sofa beside her sister, studying Sarah's face with the concern of someone who loved her, but hadn't been allowed to really see her for years. "Sarah, do you realize how concerning that sounds? You haven't had a real vacation in decades. That's not normal in a marriage." "I thought I was being supportive. Robert always said that his career supported both of us, so his preferences should take priority." Sarah laughed bitterly. "God, listening to myself say that out loud. I sound like such a fool." "You sound like a woman who loved her husband and trusted him to love her back the same way. That doesn't make you a fool, Sarah. That makes you human." Over the next few days, as Sarah began to settle into the guest bedroom that Jennifer had quickly converted into a nursery in waiting, she started to see her marriage with new clarity. The emotional patterns that had seemed normal, even loving when she was living them, now revealed themselves as something much darker. There was the way Robert dismissed her concerns as overthinking, the way he made major financial decisions without consulting her, then explained his reasoning as if she were a child who needed things simplified. The way he had gradually taken control of their social calendar, their living arrangements, even their conversations, until Sarah found herself echoing his opinions on everything from politics to restaurant choices. "It's called covert narcissism," Jennifer explained one evening as they sat on her back patio, watching the sunset paint the Miami sky in shades of orange and pink. Jennifer had been doing research, trying to understand the dynamic that had trapped her sister for so many years. "It's not the obvious, grandiose kind where someone constantly brags about themselves. It's more subtle. They make you feel like you need them, like you can't trust your own judgment, like your role in life is to support their greatness." "That sounds exactly right," Sarah said slowly. "Robert never said I was stupid, but he had this way of making me feel like my ideas were amateur hour while his were professional grade." "What was your graduate thesis about? Specifically?" Sarah's eyes lit up for the first time in months as she remembered. "I analyzed how airline deregulation in the 1970s created opportunities for new carriers to serve underserved markets. I predicted that the next big growth area would be in regional routes connecting smaller cities that the major airlines ignored." "And what's happened since then?" "Exactly what I predicted. Airlines like JetBlue and Southwest proved that you could be profitable by focusing on routes and customer segments that the legacy carriers overlooked." Jennifer shook her head in amazement. "Sarah, you basically predicted the rise of budget airlines 20 years before it happened. That wasn't amateur hour, that was genius." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her thesis hadn't been cute academic theorizing, as Robert had always characterized it. It had been genuine insight into market dynamics that had later proven exactly correct. How many other ideas had she discarded because Robert's dismissive response had made her doubt her own expertise that night? Sarah called Robert for the first time since the airport. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the slightly annoyed tone he used when interrupted during work. "Sarah, darling, how are you feeling? I hope you're getting plenty of rest." The patronizing concern in his voice made her stomach clench. "Robert, we need to talk. About our marriage. About what happened at the airport. About what comes next." "What comes next is you coming home so we can start preparing for the baby. I've already had Margaret research the best obstetricians in Greenwich. We'll want someone affiliated with Yale New Haven." "Of course." Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual way Robert made decisions that affected her life without consulting her. What if I don't want to come back to Greenwich? What if I want to stay in Miami for a while? The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. When Robert spoke again, his voice was ice cold. Sarah, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. Pregnancy can do that to women sometimes. Maybe you should see a therapist. I'm not having a breakdown. Robert, I'm having a breakthrough. Fine. Do whatever you need to do. But don't expect me to put my life on hold while you figure yourself out. I have responsibilities. The line went dead, and Sarah stared at her phone. For the first time in their marriage, Robert's anger didn't devastate her. Instead, it clarified something she had been afraid to acknowledge. She didn't actually want him to put his life on hold for her. She wanted him to disappear entirely so she could figure out who she was without his constant criticism and control. The next morning, Sarah enrolled in her first online course in airline management in 20 years. As she filled out the registration form, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: excitement about her own future. 3 weeks into her stay in Miami, Sarah was deep into her coursework when Jennifer burst through the front door with news that would change everything. Sarah, you need to see this. I was having lunch with Rebecca Martinez, you remember. She works for that aviation consulting firm downtown. She showed me something that I think you'll find very interesting. Jennifer spread a series of documents across the kitchen table: market analysis reports, route profitability studies, and passenger demographic data for South Florida airports. Sarah's pulse quickened as she scanned the information, her business school training kicking in after years of dormancy. Look at this, Jennifer pointed to a highlighted section. There's a massive gap in service between Miami and the Caribbean islands. The major airlines focus on the big destinations like Jamaica and the Dominican Republic, but there are dozens of smaller islands that are underserved. Sarah studied the data more carefully, her mind racing through the implications. Jennifer, this is exactly what I wrote about in my thesis. Small markets that the legacy carriers ignore because they can't generate enough volume to justify their large aircraft and complex route structures. But a smaller airline with the right aircraft could serve those routes profitably. Absolutely. You'd use something like a regional jet, maybe a 50 to 70-seat aircraft, and focus on business travelers and tourists who are willing to pay a premium for direct flights instead of connecting through hubs. Over the next several days, Sarah threw herself into researching the South Florida aviation market with an intensity she hadn't felt since graduate school. She analyzed everything: passenger traffic patterns, aircraft utilization rates, regulatory requirements, competitive landscapes, and operational costs. What she found was a genuine business opportunity hiding in plain sight. The established airlines, American, Delta, JetBlue, were all focused on high-volume routes to major destinations, but there were wealthy enclaves throughout the Caribbean that generated steady business travel and tourism demand without the volume to attract the big carriers' attention. Islands like St. Bart's, Anguilla, and the Turks and Caicos were served by small charter companies or required multiple connections through Puerto Rico or other hubs. What if you could offer direct flights from Miami to these destinations? Sarah asked Jennifer over dinner. Premium service, convenient scheduling, aircraft sized appropriately for the market. It sounds like it could work. But Sarah, starting an airline is incredibly complicated. The regulations, the capital requirements, the operational expertise, all challenges, not impossibilities. And I have something most aviation entrepreneurs don't have. What's that? A substantial divorce settlement that's about to come my way, whether Robert likes it or not. The call to Robert's lawyer came the next morning. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but her research had given her new confidence in her ability to navigate complex business decisions. James, this is Sarah Montgomery. I need to discuss the financial arrangements for our separation. James Peterson had been Robert's attorney for 15 years, handling everything from real estate transactions to business acquisitions. His voice carried the same patronizing tone that Sarah had learned to expect from Robert's professional circle. Mrs. Montgomery, I hope you're feeling better. Robert mentioned you were having some emotional difficulties related to your pregnancy. Sarah felt her temper flare at the casual way her husband was characterizing her decision to assert some independence as emotional instability. James, I'm not having emotional difficulties. I'm having legal ones. Specifically, I need to understand my rights regarding marital assets and support obligations. Well, of course you're entitled to reasonable support during your pregnancy and for the child, but I hope you understand that Robert's business interests require careful protection. We can't have any impulsive decisions affecting the family's long-term financial stability. The assumption that any decision she made would be impulsive, while Robert's choices were automatically careful, was exactly the kind of sexist dismissal that had kept her trapped for years. But now, instead of making her doubt herself, it made her furious. James, I graduated summa cum laude from Columbia Business School. I'm perfectly capable of making rational financial decisions. What I need from you is a comprehensive accounting of all marital assets and an estimate of what a fair settlement would look like if Robert and I decided to divorce. The silence on the other end of the line told Sarah everything she needed to know. Neither Robert nor his lawyer had expected her to approach this situation with businesslike clarity. They had been counting on her emotional vulnerability to accept whatever terms they offered. Mrs. Montgomery, I think we should wait until you're back in New York and can discuss this with Robert directly. No, James, we're going to discuss this now with full financial disclosure, or I'm going to hire my own attorney and we can do this the hard way. That evening, Sarah called the one person she knew who could give her honest advice about the aviation industry, her former thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, who was now a professor emeritus at Columbia and served on the boards of several transportation companies. Sarah, what a lovely surprise. How are you? Dear, I'm well, Professor Williams. Actually, I'm better than I've been in years. I'm calling because I'm considering a career change, and I wanted to get your thoughts on something. Sarah explained her situation, the separation from Robert, her pregnancy, her discovery of the market opportunity in Caribbean aviation. She outlined her preliminary business plan, the route analysis she had conducted, and the financial resources she would have available. Professor Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of approval or interest. When Sarah finished her presentation, there was a long pause. Sarah, this is remarkable work. The market analysis is sophisticated, the competitive positioning is smart, and the financial projections seem realistic. How long have you been working on this? About a month, since I started taking online courses in airline management. A month, my dear. This is the kind of strategic thinking that consulting firms charge millions to produce. You haven't lost your touch of anything. Your analytical skills have improved with experience. The validation from someone whose opinion Sarah deeply respected was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt like her intellectual capabilities were being taken seriously by someone who understood the business world. Do you think it could actually work? Could someone like me really start an airline? Sarah, the aviation industry needs more people like you. People who understand that success comes from serving customers better, not just competing on price. The major carriers have become so focused on cost-cutting that they've forgotten what customer service means. There's definitely room for a boutique airline that prioritizes the passenger experience. After hanging up, Sarah sat on Jennifer's back patio, looking out at the lights of Miami twinkling in the distance. For the first time since the airport abandonment, she felt genuinely excited about her future. Not nervous or apprehensive, but energized by possibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Called Peterson. This divorce talk is ridiculous. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. Sarah smiled as she typed her response. I am discussing it like an adult, with lawyers and financial advisors and anyone else I choose to consult. That's what adults do when they make important decisions. She hit send and immediately blocked his number. Sarah Montgomery was done being managed. 6 weeks into her Miami residency, Sarah had transformed Jennifer's spare bedroom into what looked like a war room. The walls were covered with route maps, aircraft specifications, regulatory documents, and financial projections. Her laptop was constantly open, displaying spreadsheets that tracked everything from fuel costs to gate fees to projected passenger loads. You know, Jennifer said one morning, bringing Sarah coffee and prenatal vitamins. When I said you could stay as long as you needed, I didn't expect you to turn my house into a business school case study. Sarah looked up from her computer screen, where she was analyzing the operational costs of different aircraft types. At 12 weeks pregnant, she was finally past the worst of her morning sickness and had more energy than she'd had in months. I'm sorry, Jen. I know I've taken over your space. It's just that this feels like the first meaningful work I've done in decades. Don't apologize. I love seeing you this engaged. David keeps saying he hasn't seen you this animated since our wedding 15 years ago. The comment hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. Had she really been sleepwalking through her life for that long? Had her sister's husband noticed her emotional absence more clearly than her own spouse had? Jennifer, can I ask you something personal? Always. Do you think Robert ever loved me? Really loved me? Not just the idea of being married to someone who made him look good. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. I think Robert loved the version of you that served his needs, but I'm not sure he ever bothered to know the real Sarah well enough to love her. The honesty of the observation was painful but clarifying. Sarah had spent 24 years trying to be the woman Robert needed, instead of figuring out who she actually was. No wonder she felt like a stranger to herself. Well, Sarah said, closing her laptop and stretching, the real Sarah is apparently someone who wants to start an airline. Let me show you what I figured out. Over the next hour, Sarah walked Jennifer through her business plan with the kind of detailed analysis that would have impressed the most demanding venture capitalist. She had identified 12 underserved routes between Miami and Caribbean destinations, calculated the optimal aircraft size for each market, projected passenger loads based on tourism and business travel patterns, and even located potential investors who specialized in transportation startups. Sarah, this is incredibly sophisticated. How did you learn all this? Some of it I remembered from business school, but mostly I've been taking online courses and reading everything I can find about regional airline operations. It turns out my brain still works pretty well when I'm working on something that interests me. The centerpiece of Sarah's plan was elegantly simple. Atlantic Breeze Airlines would operate a fleet of 50-seat regional jets, offering premium service on routes that were too small for major carriers, but too large for charter operators. Instead of competing directly with American and Delta on their high-volume routes, Atlantic Breeze would create its own market by connecting Miami to destinations that currently required multiple connections or uncomfortable flights on small charter planes. The key insight, Sarah explained, pulling up a map of potential routes, is that wealthy travelers will pay a significant premium for convenience and comfort. A businessman in Nassau who needs to get to Miami for a meeting doesn't want to connect through Atlanta or New York. He wants a direct flight that gets him there in 90 minutes. And the market research supports this. Sarah showed Jennifer passenger surveys and traffic data that demonstrated consistent demand for better service to the destination she was targeting. There are thousands of people every year who either drive to other cities to catch direct flights or pay premium prices to charter private jets. We can offer them a middle option, better than commercial, cheaper than charter. The financial projections were equally impressive, with used regional jets available for lease at attractive rates due to COVID-related airline downsizing. Sarah's startup costs were manageable. Her projected operating margins were healthy, and she had identified several potential revenue streams beyond basic passenger service cargo, charter flights, and partnerships with luxury hotels and resorts. The best part, Sarah concluded, is that I don't need to be profitable on day one. Robert's divorce settlement is going to give me enough capital to operate for at least 2 years while we build the customer base. Speaking of Robert, have you heard from him lately? Sarah's expression darkened slightly. He's been calling through intermediaries, his lawyer, his secretary, even his mother. The message is always the same: come home. Stop being dramatic. We can work this out. But you don't want to work it out. Jennifer, I've been more intellectually stimulated in the past 6 weeks than I was in the past 6 years of my marriage. I'm not going back to a life where my biggest decision is what to serve at dinner parties for Robert's clients. That afternoon brought a surprise visitor that would prove crucial to Sarah's plans. Dr. Patricia Williams had flown down from New York specifically to meet with Sarah about her airline concept. Professor Williams, I can't believe you came all this way. Sarah, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of smart people with interesting ideas, but I've rarely seen anything as well-researched and strategically sound as what you've developed. They spent 3 hours going through Sarah's business plan line by line. Professor Williams challenged assumptions, suggested modifications, and provided insights that could only come from decades of experience in the transportation industry. But her overall assessment was unequivocally positive. My dear, you've identified a genuine market opportunity and developed a realistic plan to exploit it. More importantly, you have the intellectual capabilities and business acumen to execute this plan successfully. But I've never actually run a company, never managed employees, never dealt with regulators. Neither had Richard Branson when he started Virgin Atlantic. Neither had David Neeleman when he founded JetBlue. What they had was vision, determination, and the ability to surround themselves with people who had the operational expertise they lacked. Professor Williams reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. I want you to call this man. His name is Carlos Rodriguez, and he's the former VP of operations for a regional airline that was acquired by United 5 years ago. He's been consulting for various aviation startups, and I think he'd be interested in your project. You really think I could do this? Sarah, I don't just think you could do this. I think you're going to do this, and I want to be involved. Professor Williams smiled. I'd like to join your board of advisors, if you'll have me. That evening, Sarah called Carlos Rodriguez. The conversation that followed changed everything. Carlos was a 25-year veteran of the airline industry with experience in operations, safety, regulatory compliance, and aircraft acquisition. He had been looking for the right opportunity to get involved with a startup, and Sarah's business plan was exactly what he had been hoping to find. Ms. Montgomery, I've reviewed your materials, and I have to say, this is some of the best market analysis I've seen from an aviation entrepreneur. Most people who want to start airlines are aviation enthusiasts who don't understand business. You're a business expert who understands aviation. That's a much rarer and more valuable combination. Would you be interested in joining the company as Chief Operating Officer? I'd be honored to, but I have one condition. Sarah's heart sank, expecting some impossible demand or deal-breaking requirement. What's the condition? I want to invest my own money in the company. I don't just want to work for Atlantic Breeze Airlines. I want to own part of it. Sarah hung up the phone and immediately called Jennifer, who was having dinner with friends at a restaurant in South Beach. Jen, it's happening. I have an advisor, an operations expert, and a business plan that actual industry professionals think could work. I'm really going to start an airline. Sarah, are you sure about this? Once you file the paperwork and start spending money, there's no going back. That's exactly why I'm sure. For the first time in 24 years, I don't want to go back. 3 months into Sarah's pregnancy and her new life in Miami, the call she had been dreading finally came. Robert's name appeared on her phone screen at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, which meant he was calling from New York before work, never a good sign. Sarah, we need to talk. My lawyers have reviewed your business plan documents, and I'm afraid I can't allow this to continue. Sarah sat up in bed, immediately alert. How did you get my business plan documents? That's not important. What's important is that you're about to make a huge mistake with our family's money. Starting an airline is incredibly risky, and I won't let you gamble away our child's financial security on some midlife crisis fantasy. The condescending tone was familiar, but Sarah's reaction to it was completely different now. Instead of feeling ashamed or uncertain, she felt a cold fury that cleared her thinking like nothing else could. First of all, Robert, it's not our money anymore. We're separated, and whatever settlement I receive will be mine to do with as I choose. Second, it's not a midlife crisis fantasy. It's a legitimate business opportunity based on thorough market research. Sarah, you haven't worked in the business world for decades. You have no experience running a company, managing employees, dealing with regulators. You're going to lose everything. Maybe I will, but that's my choice to make. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Robert threatened to contest any divorce settlement that gave Sarah enough capital to fund her airline. He suggested that her pregnancy was affecting her judgment and that she should consider psychiatric evaluation. He even implied that her fitness as a mother was in question given her erratic behavior. Erratic behavior, Sarah repeated. You mean like learning new skills, developing a business plan, and making decisions about my own future? I mean like abandoning your marriage and running away to Florida to play entrepreneur while you're carrying my child. I didn't abandon anything. Robert, you left me at an airport. Remember, after hanging up, Sarah called her lawyer, Amanda Chen, whom she had retained the previous month on Professor Williams' recommendation. Amanda was a partner at one of Miami's most prestigious family law firms and specialized in high net worth divorces involving complex asset division. Amanda, I think we need to accelerate the divorce proceedings. Robert is threatening to challenge any settlement that gives me access to significant assets. Sarah, I need to warn you that this could get very ugly. Men like your husband don't typically accept losing control gracefully, especially when their wives assert financial independence. How ugly are we talking? He'll attack your credibility, your mental stability, your fitness as a mother. He'll try to paint your business plan as proof that you're not capable of making rational financial decisions. He might even try to get temporary custody of the child once it's born, using your airline startup as evidence that you're prioritizing business over motherhood. Sarah felt a chill of fear, but underneath it was something stronger: determination. Amanda, what do we need to do to protect myself and my company? We need to establish your financial independence and business competence beyond any doubt. We need character witnesses who can testify to your mental stability and professional capabilities. And we need to be prepared for them to get very personal about your marriage and your motivations. The next few weeks were a blur of legal preparation and business development. Sarah continued working on her airline plan while simultaneously preparing for what promised to be a brutal divorce battle. She underwent psychological evaluation at Amanda's suggestion, participated in extensive depositions, and provided documentation of every aspect of her business plan to demonstrate that it was based on rational analysis rather than emotional impulse. The psychological evaluation results were particularly satisfying. Dr. Michael Foster, a forensic psychologist with extensive experience in custody evaluations, concluded that Sarah showed no signs of mental illness, emotional instability, or impaired judgment. Her decision-making process appears rational and well-informed, and her business plan demonstrates sophisticated analytical thinking. But Robert's legal team was just getting started. They filed motions challenging Sarah's right to start a business with marital assets, questioning her competence to manage corporate finances, and requesting detailed financial disclosure of all her business activities. Each motion required hours of Amanda's time and thousands of dollars in legal fees. This is deliberate, Amanda explained during one of their strategy sessions. They're trying to exhaust your financial resources and emotional energy so you'll accept a smaller settlement rather than continue fighting. How long can this go on? Months, potentially. High-conflict divorces involving substantial assets can drag on for years if both sides are determined to fight. The stress of the legal battle began affecting Sarah's pregnancy. She was experiencing more fatigue, occasional headaches, and a level of anxiety that she knew wasn't healthy for her or the baby. But every time she considered backing down, she thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago: frightened, dependent, convinced that her value lay in how well she supported someone else's ambitions. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer called one evening with news that would change everything. Sarah, you need to sit down. I just got off the phone with Rebecca Martinez, remember? My friend who works in aviation consulting. She heard through industry contacts that Robert's company has been having serious financial problems. What kind of problems? The kind that might explain why he's so desperate to control your divorce settlement. Rebecca says there are rumors about cash flow issues, client defections, and some kind of investigation by the SEC. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Robert's company was in trouble, his aggressive stance on their divorce might not be about controlling her. It might be about protecting himself. Jennifer, I need to call Amanda right away. The conversation with her lawyer lasted until midnight. Amanda agreed to hire a financial investigator to look into Robert's business affairs, and what they found was shocking. Montgomery Capital Management wasn't just having financial difficulties, it was on the verge of collapse. Robert had been using increasingly risky investment strategies to maintain the appearance of success, and several major clients had discovered losses that they had not been informed about. The SEC investigation was real, and if it proceeded, Robert could face both civil and criminal charges. Sarah, this changes everything, Amanda said during their emergency meeting the next morning. Robert isn't trying to protect family assets from your risky business venture. He's trying to hide his own assets from potential lawsuits and regulatory penalties. What does that mean for our case? It means we hold all the cards now. If Robert wants to avoid having his financial crimes become part of the divorce proceedings, he's going to have to give you everything you're asking for. The confrontation came 2 weeks later, when Robert flew to Miami with his legal team for what he assumed would be settlement negotiations on his terms. Sarah watched him walk into Amanda's conference room and was struck by how different he looked older, more tired, with the slightly desperate air of a man whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. "Robert," Amanda began, "we need to discuss the SEC investigation into Montgomery Capital Management's client account management." The color drained from Robert's face. "I don't know what you're talking about. We have documentation of unauthorized trades, misrepresented returns, and commingled client funds. We also have correspondence suggesting that you've been using company assets to fund personal expenses, including gifts for your girlfriend." Sarah watched her husband's face as the evidence mounted against him. The man who had spent decades making her feel intellectually inferior was revealed as someone who had been lying and stealing to maintain his lifestyle. "What do you want?" Robert asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Full financial disclosure, an uncontested divorce with Sarah retaining all rights to her business ventures, and a substantial settlement that reflects the deception you've engaged in throughout your marriage," Amanda replied. "And if I agree to these terms, the information about your business practices remains confidential. If you don't agree, Sarah is prepared to testify about your financial crimes as part of the divorce proceedings, which would become public record." The legal maneuvering took another month, but the outcome was everything Sarah had hoped for. She received a settlement that gave her complete financial independence, sole custody of their unborn child, and the freedom to pursue her business ventures without interference. The day the divorce papers were signed, Sarah stood in her lawyer's office, looking out at the Miami skyline where construction cranes worked constantly to build new dreams into reality. "How does it feel to be officially single and financially independent?" Amanda asked. "It feels like the first day of the rest of my life," Sarah replied, placing her hand on her growing belly. "Did you hear that? Little one mommy just became an entrepreneur." Sakurm. 6 months pregnant and officially divorced, Sarah threw herself into building Atlantic Breeze Airlines with the intensity of someone who had 20 years of suppressed ambition to work through. She had moved into her own apartment in Coral Gables, a bright, airy space near the airport where she could watch planes take off and land from her office window. The business was taking shape faster than she had dared hope. Carlos Rodriguez had proven to be everything Professor Williams had promised, an operational expert who understood both the regulatory complexities of starting an airline and the practical challenges of day-to-day operations. "Sarah, I've negotiated lease agreements for our first 3 aircraft," Carlos announced during their weekly planning meeting. 2 Bombardier CRJ-700s and 1 Embraer E-175, all low hours, excellent maintenance records, available for immediate delivery. Sarah looked at the photographs of the aircraft, sleek regional jets that would soon wear the Atlantic Breeze livery. She had designed herself a sophisticated teal and gold color scheme that evoked both the Caribbean waters and the Miami sky. "What about crew training and certification?" "I've identified 8 pilots and 12 flight attendants from my network of former colleagues, all experienced with regional operations, all excited about joining a startup where they can have real input into our service standards." The regulatory approval process was proving more complex than Sarah had anticipated, but less intimidating than she had feared. Her business school training in operations management translated well to the detailed documentation required by the FAA, and Carlos's experience navigated them through the bureaucratic maze. "The key," Carlos explained, "is that we're not trying to reinvent aviation. We're taking proven operational procedures and applying them to an underserved market. The regulators like that. It shows we're serious about safety and compliance." Sarah's pregnancy was progressing normally, though she found herself constantly amazed by her body's ability to create life while her mind was creating a business. Her obstetrician, Dr. Maria Santos, was supportive of Sarah's entrepreneurial activities, but insisted on regular monitoring to ensure the stress wasn't affecting the baby. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Santos announced during Sarah's 28-week appointment. "Baby is growing perfectly. Your blood pressure is normal. And honestly, you seem happier and healthier than most of my patients. I feel better than I have in years. Is that normal?" For someone who has found her purpose, absolutely. Pregnancy can be incredibly energizing when you're excited about the future you're building for your child. The future Sarah was building was ambitious but achievable. Atlantic Breeze Airlines would launch with service to 6 Caribbean destinations, operating 12 flights per day with a focus on premium customer experience. Instead of competing on price with the major carriers, they would compete on convenience, comfort, and personalized service. The financial projections were solid. Sarah's market research had identified consistent demand for better service to their target destinations, and her pricing strategy allowed for healthy margins while remaining competitive with the combination of airfare and hotel packages that most travelers currently used. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Jennifer called one afternoon with news that made Sarah's heart race. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this." David was at a marine biology conference in Key Largo, and he overheard two executives from a major hotel chain talking about the challenges of getting guests to their Caribbean properties. They were specifically complaining about the lack of direct flights from Miami to several of the islands you're planning to serve. Did he get their names? Better than that, he introduced himself and mentioned that his sister-in-law was starting a regional airline focused on those exact routes. They want to meet with you about a potential partnership. The meeting with Coastal Resorts International took place the following week at their headquarters in Fort Lauderdale. Sarah arrived with a presentation that outlined how Atlantic Breeze could solve their customer transportation challenges while creating a mutually profitable partnership. "Ms. Montgomery," said Patricia Valdez, Coastal's VP of Guest Experience, "we've been struggling with this problem for years. Our guests love our properties, but getting to them is such a hassle that we lose business to resorts that are easier to reach." Sarah's proposal was elegantly simple. Atlantic Breeze would offer package deals that combined airfare with hotel stays, creating a seamless travel experience that was more convenient than anything currently available. Coastal Resorts would promote the flights to their guests and receive a commission on bookings, while Atlantic Breeze would gain access to a ready-made customer base. "We're talking about potentially thousands of passengers per year," Sarah explained, showing them her market analysis. "Business travelers who need to get to these destinations for meetings, tourists who want luxury vacations without the hassle of complex travel arrangements, families who want direct flights to their favorite Caribbean hideaways." The partnership agreement was signed 2 weeks later, providing Atlantic Breeze with its first major client and a steady revenue stream even before their inaugural flight. As Sarah entered her third trimester, she found herself working from a reclining chair in her apartment office. Her laptop balanced on her growing belly while she managed everything from aircraft interior design to pilot training schedules. The baby seemed to enjoy the activity. She was most active when Sarah was deep in business planning, as if she could sense her mother's excitement about the future they were building together. The call from Robert came on a Tuesday evening in late February, just as Sarah was reviewing final preparations for Atlantic Breeze's launch, scheduled for April 15th. "Sarah, I've been following your airline venture in the business press. I wanted to congratulate you." The tone was different, less condescending, more genuinely respectful. Sarah found herself curious despite everything that had happened between them. "Thank you, Robert. How are things with you?" "Difficult. If I'm being honest, the SEC investigation is ongoing. I've had to shut down the firm, and I'm facing both civil and criminal charges. It looks like I'll probably have to declare personal bankruptcy." Sarah felt an unexpected surge of pity for the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life. "I'm sorry to hear that. Sarah, I need you to know that I understand now what I lost when I lost you. You were never the problem in our marriage. I was." The admission was so unprecedented that Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. For 24 years, Robert had never acknowledged being wrong about anything, much less admitted to fundamental flaws in his character. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because watching you build something successful while my world falls apart has made me realize what real strength looks like. You took the worst thing I could do to you, abandoning you when you needed me most, and turned it into the best thing that ever happened to you. It wasn't easy, Robert. I know. And I know I have no right to ask. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry for all the ways I made you doubt yourself over the years." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office chair, watching the lights of Miami International Airport twinkle in the distance. Tomorrow, she would take delivery of Atlantic Breeze's first aircraft. In 6 weeks, she would give birth to her daughter. In 3 months, She would launch her airline with the kind of market analysis and operational planning that would have impressed her business school professors. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport 9 months ago had built something that no one could ever take away from her, and she was just getting started. Sarah's daughter arrived 3 weeks early, on a brilliant March morning when the Miami sky was the same shade of teal as the Atlantic breeze livery. Elena Jennifer Montgomery was born at 6:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and she entered the world with the kind of determined cry that suggested she had inherited her mother's opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. "She's beautiful," Jennifer whispered, holding her new niece while Sarah recovered from delivery. "And she has your eyes." Sarah looked down at her daughter, feeling a fierce protectiveness that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Elena was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, and an alert gaze that seemed to take in everything around her with serious consideration. "Elena, welcome to the world," Sarah whispered. "You're going to grow up watching your mama run an airline." Dr. Santos had cleared Sarah for light business activities within a week of delivery, which was fortunate because Atlantic Breeze's inaugural flight was scheduled for April 15th, just 3 weeks away. Sarah had prepared for this by training her management team to handle operations during her maternity leave, but there were still decisions that required her attention. Carlos had converted the guest bedroom of Sarah's apartment into a temporary nursery and office space, complete with a crib positioned where Sarah could see Elena while working on her laptop. It wasn't ideal, but it allowed her to breastfeed on schedule while managing the final preparations for the airline's launch. "Sarah, the FAA has completed their final inspection of our operations," Carlos reported during their first post-birth planning meeting. "We're officially certified to begin commercial service. And the crew training completed last week. Everyone is excited about our service standards. They've never worked for an airline that prioritizes passenger experience over cost-cutting." Sarah had insisted on service standards that put Atlantic Breeze in a different category from typical regional carriers. Every flight would include complimentary snacks and beverages, extra legroom, priority boarding for families, and personal attention from flight attendants who were empowered to solve problems rather than just follow scripts. "It's going to cost more than the bare-bones approach," Sarah had explained to her investors, "but our customers are paying for convenience and comfort. They're business travelers who bill their time at $300 an hour, or vacationers who have saved for months to afford a Caribbean getaway. They're not looking for the cheapest option, they're looking for the best value." The launch marketing campaign had generated more interest than Sarah had anticipated. Aviation Week had run a feature story about the former corporate wife who built an airline from scratch. Forbes had included Sarah on their list of female entrepreneurs to watch. Most importantly, advanced bookings for the first month of operations were running at 85% capacity. The inaugural flight was scheduled for 7:00 a.m. on April 15th, Miami to Nassau, with Sarah and Elena as passengers on what would technically be Atlantic Breeze's first revenue flight. "Are you sure about this?" Jennifer asked as they prepared to leave for the airport. "Elena is only 3 weeks old. Maybe you should wait a few more months before making public appearances." "Jen, this flight represents everything I've been working toward for the past year. I want Elena to be part of it from the very beginning." The scene at Miami International Airport was surreal. Sarah walked through the terminal carrying her 3-week-old daughter. Wearing the Atlantic Breeze uniform, she had designed a sophisticated teal blazer with gold piping that somehow managed to look professional, even on a woman who had given birth less than a month ago. The gate area was crowded with reporters, photographers, and curious passengers who had booked the inaugural flight specifically to be part of aviation history. Sarah recognized several faces from the Miami business community, including executives from Coastal Resorts International and other potential partners. "Ms. Montgomery, how does it feel to be launching your airline so soon after giving birth?" asked a reporter from the Miami Herald. "It feels like everything in my life led to this moment," Sarah replied, adjusting Elena's blanket. "Elena is going to grow up in a world where her mother built something meaningful, where women don't have to choose between family and career success." The flight itself was everything Sarah had envisioned. The Bombardier CRJ 700 was configured with just 60 seats instead of the typical 70, providing the extra space that made the 90-minute flight genuinely comfortable. The flight attendants, 3 experienced professionals whom Carlos had recruited from major carriers, provided the kind of personalized service that passengers remembered and talked about. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Atlantic Breeze Flight 100 to Nassau, announced Captain Patricia Martinez, whom Sarah had hired as their chief pilot specifically because she wanted female leadership visible in the cockpit. We're honored to have you with us for our inaugural flight, and we're excited to show you what regional aviation can be when passenger experience is the top priority. As the aircraft climbed away from Miami, Sarah looked out at the city where she had rebuilt her life. Below, she could see the apartment where she had written her business plan, the office building where she had signed her first aircraft lease, the hospital where Elena had been born. Everything looked different from 30,000 feet smaller, more manageable, part of a larger story that was still being written. Elena slept peacefully in her carrier, unbothered by the engine noise or the gentle turbulence that marked their passage over the Florida Straits. At 3 weeks old, she was already a more experienced air traveler than most adults. The landing in Nassau was smooth, and the reception was everything Sarah could have hoped for. The Bahamas Minister of Tourism was waiting at the gate with a traditional Caribbean welcome, complete with a steel drum band and local dancers. Atlantic Breeze had worked with the Nassau Tourism Board to make their arrival a celebration of the new connectivity between Miami and the islands. This represents exactly the kind of service we've been hoping for, the minister told the gathered press. Direct flights with premium service that make it easier for both business travelers and tourists to choose the Bahamas as their destination. The return flight that afternoon was fully booked, with passengers who had specifically chosen Atlantic Breeze over the larger carriers because of the convenience and service quality. Sarah spent the flight walking through the cabin, talking with passengers about their experience and gathering feedback that would help refine their operations. "This is how flying should be," one businessman told her. "No crowds, no stress, just efficient service that gets me where I need to go. I'll be booking with you exclusively from now on." As they descended into Miami, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The woman who had been abandoned at this very airport 11 months ago was now landing as the CEO of a successful airline, with her healthy daughter sleeping in her arms and a business that was exceeding all projections. Jennifer was waiting at the gate when they deplaned, along with Carlos, Professor Williams, and several other members of Sarah's growing team. "How was it?" Jennifer asked, taking Elena while Sarah was surrounded by congratulatory hugs. "It was perfect. Everything worked exactly as we planned. The passengers loved the service, and we're already getting inquiries about adding more destinations." Professor Williams beamed with pride. "Sarah, I knew you could do this, but seeing it actually happen is extraordinary. You've created something that the industry needs proof that you can be profitable while treating customers well." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment office, Elena sleeping peacefully in her crib while Sarah reviewed the day's operational data. Every metric exceeded expectations: on-time performance, passenger satisfaction scores, load factors, even the ancillary revenue from their partnership with coastal resorts. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Her divorce attorney saw the news coverage of your inaugural flight. "Robert must be eating his heart out watching your success while he faces bankruptcy. You did it, Sarah. You actually did it." Sarah looked out at the lights of Miami International Airport, where 3 Atlantic Breeze aircraft now sat at their designated gates, ready for tomorrow's flights. In 6 months, she planned to expand to 12 destinations. In 2 years, she hoped to have a fleet of 10 aircraft. In 5 years, Atlantic Breeze would be the premier regional carrier in the Caribbean. But more importantly, Elena would grow up watching her mother build something meaningful, seeing daily proof that dreams could become reality when you were willing to work for them. Sarah Montgomery had discovered that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise, and she was just getting started. 6 months after Atlantic Breeze's successful launch, Sarah was learning that running a profitable airline was both easier and harder than she had anticipated. The business was exceeding financial projections. They had achieved profitability in their 4th month of operations, something almost unheard of in the aviation industry. But success brought its own challenges, including competitors who were beginning to take notice of their market share. "Sarah, we have a problem," Carlos announced during their Monday morning operations meeting. "American Airlines just announced new direct service to 3 of our destinations, and they're pricing their flights 30% below our fares." Sarah looked up from the financial reports spread across her desk, Elena sleeping peacefully in the carrier beside her chair. At 6 months old, Elena had become a fixture in the Atlantic Breeze offices, charming employees and clients alike, while her mother managed the daily challenges of growing a business. They're trying to price us out of the market. Classic predatory pricing. They can absorb losses on these routes because they make money elsewhere. The question is, do we try to match their fares or do we compete on service quality? This was the kind of decision that kept Sarah awake at night. She had built Atlantic Breeze on the premise that customers would pay premium prices for superior service. But that theory had never been tested against aggressive competition from a major carrier with deep pockets. What do our passenger surveys tell us about price sensitivity? Carlos pulled out a tablet displaying customer feedback data. 85% of our regular customers say they would continue flying with us even if competitors offered lower fares, as long as our prices remained within 15% of the competition. So we have some pricing flexibility, but not unlimited. Exactly. We could probably maintain our current service levels and pricing if we're only 15 to 20% above Americans' fares, but 30% might be too big a gap. Sarah stood up and walked to her office window, where she could see the Atlantic Breeze maintenance hangar. The view never failed to amaze her, concrete proof that she had built something real, something that employed 47 people and served thousands of passengers every month. Carlos, what would it cost to match Americans' pricing exactly? We'd have to eliminate the complimentary snacks, reduce our flight attendant staffing, and probably cut back on some of the service touches that differentiate us. Basically, we'd have to become a typical low-cost carrier. And if we do that, what's our competitive advantage? Frequency and direct routes. But American could add more flights anytime they want to squeeze us further. Sarah picked up Elena, who was beginning to fuss, and walked her around the office while thinking through the options. This was the kind of strategic challenge she had studied in business school, but never faced in real life: how to compete against a larger, better financed competitor without sacrificing the core values that made your company special. I have an idea, but it's risky. What if we don't compete on price at all? What if we double down on service quality and actually raise our prices? Carlos looked at her as if she had suggested flying aircraft upside down. Raise prices while the competition is lowering them. Think about it. Our customers are business travelers and affluent tourists. They're not choosing airlines based on saving $50. They're choosing based on convenience, comfort, and reliability. If we raise our service standards even higher and market ourselves as the premium option, we might actually attract customers who are frustrated with Americans' cost-cutting. The strategy was counterintuitive, but potentially brilliant. Instead of racing to the bottom on pricing, Atlantic Breeze would position themselves as the luxury alternative: higher prices, but an experience so superior that customers would gladly pay the difference. What kind of service improvements are we talking about? Sarah was already mentally redesigning their passenger experience. Assigned seating in a 2x2 configuration instead of 3x3. Complimentary meals on all flights, not just snacks. Ground transportation partnerships so we can offer door-to-door service. Maybe even a small business class cabin on our longer routes. That would require significant investment in new aircraft interiors and operational systems. Saperfana, but it would also justify premium pricing that makes us more profitable per passenger than American could ever be on these routes. The decision to upgrade rather than downgrade was controversial among Sarah's advisors. Professor Williams supported the strategy, arguing that differentiation was always preferable to commoditization. But the financial analysts worried about the capital investment required and the risk of alienating price-sensitive customers. Sarah, you're betting the company on the assumption that enough customers will pay significantly more for better service, warned David Kim, her CFO and former Wall Street analyst. If you're wrong, we could lose money on every flight. David, if I wanted to run a low-cost airline competing purely on price, I would have started a different kind of company. Atlantic Breeze exists because there's a market for premium regional service. Americans' entry into our routes actually validates that market. They wouldn't be competing with us if we weren't succeeding. The implementation of Atlantic Breeze Premium took 4 months and nearly exhausted Sarah's cash reserves. They reconfigured their aircraft with leather seating, installed upgraded in-flight entertainment systems, partnered with local restaurants to provide gourmet meals, and trained their flight attendants in hospitality standards that rivaled those of five-star hotels. The marketing campaign was simple but effective. Why fly like everyone else when you can fly like yourself? The advertisements featured real customers talking about the difference between cramped, impersonal flights on major carriers and the relaxed, personalized experience they enjoyed on Atlantic Breeze. The results exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. Despite prices that were now 40% higher than Americans' competing flights, Atlantic Breeze's load factors actually increased. Passengers were not only willing to pay more for superior service, they were recommending the airline to friends and colleagues, creating a word-of-mouth marketing effect that money couldn't buy. "Sarah, you need to see these numbers," David announced during their quarterly review meeting. "Our revenue per passenger is up 60%. Our profit margins are higher than before American entered the market, and our customer satisfaction scores are the highest in the regional airline industry. What about Americans' routes that compete with ours? They're cutting frequencies. Word from industry contacts is that they're not achieving the passenger loads they projected, and they're losing money on the routes." Sarah smiled, bouncing Elena on her lap as her daughter played with a toy airplane. "They underestimated our customers. They assumed everyone would choose based on price, but our passengers are choosing based on value." The validation came from an unexpected source, a call from Patricia Valdez at Coastal Resorts International. "Sarah, I have to tell you, our guests are raving about the upgraded Atlantic Breeze experience. We're seeing higher customer satisfaction scores for transportation than we've ever recorded. And here's the interesting part. Our occupancy rates are actually higher for the properties served by Atlantic Breeze than for our other locations." Higher occupancy rates. People are choosing their vacation destinations based partly on the airline service. You've turned transportation into a positive part of the travel experience instead of just a necessary evil. That evening, Sarah sat on her apartment balcony, Elena playing on a blanket beside her, while she reviewed proposals for Atlantic Breeze's next phase of expansion. The airline now served 8 destinations and was considering routes to Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and several smaller Caribbean markets. But the real expansion was philosophical. Sarah had proven that you could build a profitable business by focusing on customer experience rather than cost cutting, by treating employees well rather than viewing them as expenses to be minimized, by choosing long-term value creation over short-term profit maximization. Her phone rang, displaying a number she recognized as Robert's attorney. "Ms. Montgomery, this is James Peterson. I'm calling on behalf of Robert Montgomery regarding a business opportunity he'd like to discuss with you." Sarah felt a familiar chill. Even after their divorce was finalized and his criminal charges resolved with a plea bargain, Robert apparently couldn't resist trying to insert himself into her success. "I'm not interested in any business opportunities with Robert. He's aware of Atlantic Breeze's success and would like to propose a partnership arrangement that could be mutually beneficial. He has connections in the aviation finance industry that could help with your expansion plans." "Mr. Peterson, please tell Robert that Atlantic Breeze is doing just fine without his connections or his involvement. We have all the financing we need, and we're not interested in partnerships with anyone who has a history of financial fraud." After hanging up, Sarah looked out at the lights of Miami International Airport, where Atlantic Breeze aircraft were preparing for tomorrow's flights. Elena had fallen asleep on her blanket, exhausted by a day of crawling around the office and charming everyone who met her. Sarah had built something that Robert couldn't touch, couldn't control, and couldn't take credit for. More importantly, she had built it the right way, with integrity, with respect for employees and customers, with a long-term vision that prioritized value creation over wealth extraction. Elena would grow up watching her mother demonstrate that business success and ethical behavior weren't mutually exclusive. That was a legacy worth building. 2 years after launching Atlantic Breeze Airlines, Sarah found herself standing in the departure lounge of Miami International Airport, but this time the circumstances were completely different. She was waiting to board her company's newest aircraft, a larger Embraer E190, that would inaugurate service to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and she wasn't alone. Elena, now a confident 2-year-old, was entertaining herself by waving at the ground crew through the window while chattering in the mixture of English and Spanish she had learned from the airline's bilingual staff. Jennifer stood beside them, beaming with pride at her sister's latest accomplishment. "I still can't believe you did it," Jennifer said, watching Atlantic Breeze employees prepare the gleaming aircraft for its maiden voyage. 2 years ago, you were abandoned here by your ex-husband. Now you own the airline." Sarah smiled, adjusting Elena's backpack filled with coloring books and toys for the flight. "I couldn't have done it without your support. Jen, you gave me a place to land when I needed it most." The past 18 months had been a whirlwind of growth and recognition. Atlantic Breeze now operated 12 aircraft, serving 16 destinations throughout the Caribbean and southeastern United States. They employed over 200 people and had achieved something almost unprecedented in the airline industry: consistent profitability combined with industry-leading customer satisfaction scores. The business press had taken notice. Sarah had been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine as CEO of the Year, profiled in Harvard Business Review for her innovative approach to service differentiation, and invited to speak at aviation conferences around the world about building customer-focused airlines. But the recognition that meant the most to Sarah had come just last month: an invitation to deliver the keynote address at Columbia Business School's graduation ceremony, speaking to the same auditorium where she had received her MBA 23 years earlier. "The themes I want to talk about today," Sarah had told the graduating class, "are resilience, reinvention, and the power of believing in yourself even when everyone else has written you off." She had looked out at the sea of young faces, eager, ambitious, ready to conquer the business world, and remembered herself at their age, full of dreams about aviation and international business that had seemed so achievable before life got complicated. Some of you will build the careers you're planning today. Others will discover that life has different plans for you, that the path to success isn't always linear, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you ever achieve. The speech had been video recorded and viewed over 1 million times online, generating hundreds of emails from women who felt inspired to make changes in their own lives. Many of them were in their 40s and 50s, trapped in situations that felt permanent until they heard Sarah's story. "I want you to know something," Sarah had concluded her remarks. "It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to remember who you really are underneath all the compromises you've made. And it's never too late to build something meaningful with your life." Now, preparing to board Atlantic Breeze Flight 200 to San Juan, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible day when Robert had abandoned her. The woman who had been afraid to make decisions without her husband's approval was now making strategic choices that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of customers. "Mommy, plane," Elena announced, pointing excitedly at the aircraft. "That's right, sweetheart. Mommy's plane." The Puerto Rico route represented more than just geographic expansion. It was Atlantic Breeze's entry into the mainland U.S. market, connecting Miami with one of the fastest-growing business centers in the Caribbean. Sarah had spent months negotiating with hotels, tour operators, and corporate clients to ensure the route would be profitable from day one. Carlos approached with the final pre-flight briefings, now serving as Atlantic Breeze's president of operations and Sarah's most trusted advisor. "Everything's ready, Sarah. The crew is excited. The passengers are boarding, and the San Juan Airport Authority has planned a welcome ceremony when we land. Load factors: 95% today, and advance bookings are running strong. The business community in San Juan has been very responsive to our service quality message." As they boarded the aircraft, Sarah was struck by how natural it felt to walk onto one of her own planes. The teal and gold interior was warm and inviting. The crew members were people she had hired and trained personally, and every detail reflected her vision of what air travel could be when passenger experience was the priority. Captain Martinez greeted them as they settled into their seats. Sarah had reserved the first row, so Elena would have plenty of room to move around during the flight. "Welcome aboard, boss. How does it feel to be opening our second major market?" "It feels like we're just getting started. Patricia?" The flight to San Juan took just over 2 hours, flying southeast over the Bahamas and past the Dominican Republic before descending into Puerto Rico. Elena spent most of the flight moving between her mother's lap and the aisle, charming passengers and flight attendants alike with her bilingual chatter and infectious smile. "She's going to be running this airline someday," joked Maria Santos, Atlantic Breeze's senior flight attendant. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was currently engaged in an animated conversation with a businessman about the airplane's engines, and felt a surge of pride. Elena was growing up in an environment where women led companies, where business travel was pleasant rather than stressful, where customer service meant genuine care rather than scripted responses. The landing in San Juan was smooth, and the reception was everything Sarah had hoped for. The Puerto Rico Tourism Company had organized a traditional welcome ceremony, complete with salsa dancers and local musicians. The mayor of San Juan was there to present Sarah with a key to the city, recognizing Atlantic Breeze's contribution to the island's economic development. This new service represents exactly the kind of connectivity Puerto Rico needs, the mayor told the assembled press. Direct flights with premium service that make it easier for businesses to operate between the mainland and the island, and for tourists to discover everything Puerto Rico has to offer. The return flight that evening was fully booked with passengers who had specifically chosen Atlantic Breeze because of their reputation for reliability and service. Sarah spent the flight talking with customers, gathering feedback, and refining her understanding of what this new market needed. "The difference between your airline and the others is obvious," one passenger told her. "You actually care whether we have a good experience. That's rare these days." As they descended into Miami, Sarah looked out at the city lights spread below them like a constellation. Somewhere down there was the apartment where she had written her first business plan, the office where she had negotiated her first aircraft lease, the hospital where Elena had been born into a world where her mother owned an airline. Jennifer was waiting at the gate when they landed, along with Professor Williams, who had flown down from New York specifically to be part of this milestone moment. "Sarah, congratulations on another successful route launch," Professor Williams said, embracing her former student. "The aviation industry is taking notice of what you've built here. I've had inquiries from 3 different business schools wanting case studies on Atlantic Breeze's success. It's been quite a journey from that thesis I wrote 23 years ago. The best part is that you're proving all the theories we discussed in class: customer focus, operational excellence, strategic differentiation. You're demonstrating that these principles actually work in the real world." That evening, Sarah sat in her home office reviewing the day's operational data while Elena played with toy airplanes on the floor beside her. Every metric exceeded expectations: on-time performance, passenger satisfaction, load factors, revenue per passenger. Atlantic Breeze was not just surviving in the competitive aviation industry, they were thriving. Her computer chimed with a new email. This one from an unexpected source, the CEO of Caribbean Airways, a larger regional carrier that had been watching Atlantic Breeze's growth with increasing interest. "Ms. Montgomery, I would like to discuss a potential acquisition of Atlantic Breeze Airlines. We believe your company would be a valuable addition to our route network and service portfolio. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting." Sarah stared at the email for a long moment. She had always known that Atlantic Breeze's success would eventually attract acquisition offers, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The offer was likely worth tens of millions of dollars, enough to set her and Elena up for life, to never worry about money again. But as she looked around her office, at the photographs of Atlantic Breeze aircraft and employees, at the route maps showing destinations they served, at Elena playing contentedly on the floor, Sarah realized she wasn't interested in being acquired. She had built Atlantic Breeze not just to make money, but to prove that business could be done differently. The airline employed over 200 people who believed in their mission, served thousands of customers who relied on their service, and had become a model for how companies could prioritize both profitability and human dignity. Sarah deleted the email without responding. Atlantic Breeze Airlines wasn't for sale at any price. 5 years after that life-changing day at Miami International Airport, Sarah Montgomery stood before the largest audience of her career. The International Women's Business Conference had drawn over 3,000 attendees to hear her keynote address on building businesses that build people. Elena, now 7 years old and completely comfortable in professional settings, sat in the front row between Jennifer and Professor Williams, occasionally waving at her mother on stage. At 7, Elena could identify aircraft by type and manufacturer, spoke fluent Spanish and English, and had announced her intention to be either a pilot, an astronaut, or the CEO of her own airline when she grew up. 5 years ago, Sarah began, looking out at the sea of women entrepreneurs, executives, and aspiring business leaders. I was a 51-year-old housewife who had spent 24 years supporting someone else's dreams. I had no business experience, no network of professional contacts, and no confidence in my own abilities. The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. Today, Atlantic Breeze Airlines employs over 400 people, serves 23 destinations, and has been profitable every quarter since our fourth month of operations. But the numbers don't tell the real story. Sarah clicked to her next slide, showing photographs of Atlantic Breeze employees, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, customer service representatives, all smiling and engaged in their work. The real story is about what happens when you build a company based on the radical idea that employees and customers are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. When you prioritize long-term value creation over short-term profit extraction, when you prove that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering everything from Atlantic Breeze's service philosophy to their employee ownership program to their environmental initiatives. But the part that generated the most enthusiastic response was Sarah's discussion of the Atlantic Breeze Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs. 3 years ago, we established a foundation that provides microloans, mentorship, and business development support specifically for women over 40 who want to start their own companies. We've funded over 200 businesses so far, everything from sustainable agriculture ventures to technology startups to artisanal food companies. Sarah clicked to a slide showing some of their success stories. Maria Rodriguez, who had started a sustainable coffee roasting company in Honduras. Dr. Jennifer Park, who had developed a telemedicine platform serving rural communities. Lisa Thompson, who had built a network of affordable childcare centers in underserved neighborhoods. These women didn't need rescuing, they needed resources and recognition. They had the skills, the experience, and the determination to build successful businesses. What they lacked was access to capital and networks that take male entrepreneurs for granted. The foundation had become Sarah's second passion project, a way to systematically address the barriers that kept women from achieving economic independence. Unlike traditional venture capital firms that focused on young male entrepreneurs in technology, the Atlantic Breeze Foundation specifically sought out older women with practical business ideas that could create jobs and serve real community needs. We've learned that women over 40 make extraordinary entrepreneurs, Sarah continued. They have life experience that helps them understand customer needs. They have professional networks that they can leverage for partnerships and expertise. And they have a clarity of purpose that comes from understanding what really matters in life. The Q&A session that followed was lively and engaging, covering everything from raising capital as a female entrepreneur to balancing motherhood with business leadership to competing against larger, more established companies. How do you respond to critics who say that focusing specifically on women entrepreneurs is unfair to men? Asked one audience member. I would point out that traditional funding sources have been focusing specifically on male entrepreneurs for decades, Sarah replied. We're not excluding anyone, we're filling a gap that the market has ignored. And our results speak for themselves. The businesses we've funded have a success rate that's significantly higher than the venture capital industry average. After the conference, Sarah and Elena flew back to Miami on one of Atlantic Breeze's newest aircraft, an Airbus A220, that could serve longer routes while maintaining the premium service standards that had made the airline successful. Mommy, why do you give money to other ladies to start businesses? Elena asked as they settled into their seats. Because sometimes people have great ideas, but they need help making them real. Just like Aunt Jennifer helped me when I was starting Atlantic Breeze. Will I have to start my own business when I grow up? Sarah considered the question carefully. You can do whatever makes you happy, sweetheart. But I want you to know that you can build anything you can imagine, that your ideas matter, and that you never have to ask anyone's permission to be successful. Elena nodded seriously, then returned to her coloring book, apparently satisfied with this explanation. As they flew over the Florida Keys, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport had not only survived, she had thrived in ways she never could have imagined during those dark early days in Miami. Atlantic Breeze had become more than just an airline. It was a demonstration that businesses could operate with integrity and still be profitable. The company's employee satisfaction scores were industry-leading. Their customer loyalty was unmatched in the regional aviation sector, and their financial performance had attracted attention from business schools and management consultants around the world. But perhaps most importantly, Atlantic Breeze had become a platform for Sarah to help other women achieve economic independence. The foundation had grown into a significant force in the female entrepreneurship space, and Sarah was regularly invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events about building inclusive business ecosystems. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped even after all these years. Unexpected messages still triggered memories of Robert's attempts to control and manipulate her during their divorce. But this message was different. Miss Montgomery, my name is Rebecca Chen, and I'm a 45-year-old single mother in Seattle. I just watched your keynote speech online, and it gave me the courage to quit my corporate job and start the consulting firm I've been dreaming about for years. Thank you for showing me that it's not too late to bet on myself. Sarah smiled and showed the message to Elena, who was still coloring but listening to everything her mother did. Another lady who wants to start her own business, Elena asked. That's right. And maybe someday, if she needs help, we can support her through the foundation. I like that we help people. Mommy, me too. Sweetheart, me too. As Atlantic Breeze Flight 150 descended into Miami International Airport, Sarah looked out at the city that had become her home and her launching pad. The lights of the airport stretched out below them, with dozens of aircraft from airlines around the world preparing for their next departures. But tomorrow morning, 8 Atlantic Breeze aircraft would depart from these gates, carrying passengers to destinations throughout the Caribbean and southeastern United States. They would be staffed by employees who felt valued and respected, serving customers who expected and received exceptional service, operating profitably while maintaining the highest standards of safety and integrity. Elena had fallen asleep during the descent, her coloring book still open to a picture of an airplane that she had colored in Atlantic Breeze's distinctive teal and gold. Sarah looked at her daughter and felt the fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision she had made since learning she was pregnant 7 years ago. Elena would grow up in a world where her mother had proven that women could build airlines, could compete successfully against larger competitors, could balance family responsibilities with business leadership, and could use their success to lift up other women. She would never doubt that her ideas mattered, that her dreams were achievable, or that she had the right to pursue happiness on her own terms. As they taxied to the gate, Sarah's phone buzzed with another message, this one from Jennifer. Saw the conference live stream. Another brilliant speech. Elena looks so proud of her mom. We're all proud of you, Sarah. Sarah typed back, thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself. None of this would have happened without your support. That's what sisters are for. Now get some rest tomorrow. You're running an airline. Sarah smiled as she gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Tomorrow she would indeed be running an airline, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of customers. She would be reviewing expansion plans, analyzing market opportunities, and working to maintain the service standards that had made Atlantic Breeze successful. But tonight, she would be having dinner with Elena, reading bedtime stories about brave princesses and clever heroines, and tucking her daughter into bed with the knowledge that she was raising a child who would never accept limitations on her potential. The woman who had been abandoned at Miami International Airport had become someone who never abandoned others. The wife who had spent decades supporting someone else's dreams had become a CEO whose dreams supported entire communities. The mother who had worried about providing for her child had become a businesswoman whose success ensured Elena's future, while creating opportunities for hundreds of other families. Sarah Montgomery had learned that some endings really were beginnings in disguise, and as she walked through the airport terminal carrying her sleeping daughter, past the gate where her old life had ended and her new life had begun, she felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her home to herself. Atlantic Breeze Airlines was more than just a company. It was proof that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to bet on yourself, and never too late to build something meaningful with your life. Elena would inherit that legacy, along with the airline, the foundation, and the knowledge that her mother had refused to accept limitations on what was possible. The midlife transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. Sarah Montgomery was just getting started. Epilogue 10 years later, from the Miami Business Journal, April 15, 2034. Atlantic Breeze Airlines celebrates 10th anniversary with record growth. CEO Sarah Montgomery reflects on a decade of success in giving back Miami. Atlantic Breeze Airlines marked its 10th anniversary yesterday with the announcement of its most ambitious expansion, yet nonstop service from Miami to 15 new destinations across Latin America and the Caribbean. CEO and founder Sarah Montgomery, now 61, celebrated the milestone alongside her daughter Elena, 17, who serves as a youth ambassador for the company's environmental initiatives. 10 years ago, I was a divorced single mother with a business plan and a dream, Montgomery told a crowd of employees, customers, and diggers at yesterday's anniversary celebration. Today, we employ over 800 people, serve 45 destinations, and have helped launch more than 500 women-owned businesses through our foundation. Atlantic Breeze's success metrics are impressive by any industry standard: 94% on-time performance, the highest customer satisfaction scores in regional aviation, and profitable operations every quarter since 2024. The airline now operates 25 aircraft and has won numerous awards for customer service, employee satisfaction, and environmental responsibility. But perhaps Montgomery's greatest achievement is the Atlantic Breeze Foundation, which has provided over $50 million in microloans and business development support to female entrepreneurs across the Americas. Foundation-supported businesses now employ more than 3,000 people and generate over $100 million in annual revenue. My mother always says that business should build people, not just profits, Elena Montgomery said during yesterday's ceremony. Atlantic Breeze proves that companies can be successful while making the world better. Elena, who speaks 4 languages and has logged over 100,000 miles as a passenger on Atlantic Breeze flights, will begin studying aerospace engineering at MIT this fall. She has expressed interest in eventually joining the family business, though she notes that she may first pursue graduate degrees in business and environmental science. I want to be ready to help Atlantic Breeze become the first carbon-neutral regional airline, Elena said. My generation doesn't just want to inherit successful businesses, we want to inherit sustainable ones. Montgomery, who was recently named to Forbes' list of most influential women in business, shows no signs of slowing down. Atlantic Breeze is currently developing partnerships with sustainable aviation fuel producers, piloting electric aircraft for short-haul routes, and planning to launch a business school scholarship program for women from underserved communities. The best part about building something meaningful, Montgomery reflected, is that it creates a platform for building even more meaningful things. We're not just running an airline, we're demonstrating what business can be when it serves all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Looking back on her journey from abandoned wife to industry leader, Montgomery offers advice that resonates far beyond the aviation sector. It's never too late to start over, never too late to bet on yourself, and never too late to build something that matters. The only thing stopping you is the story you tell yourself about what's possible.